He looked me in the eye, and he said, "You are uneducated. You are worthless. And nothing you ever do will change that." And I sat there, 17 years old, shaking. Because I didn't know yet that those words were about to become the most important thing that ever happened to me. My name is Marcus Cole. And for the first 16 years of my life, I believed every single thing my father ever told me. Not because he was kind. Not because he was loving. But because he was loud, and he was certain, and when you're a kid, certainty feels like truth. My father, David Cole, was not a cruel man by accident. He was cruel by design. He had a system, a method. He had spent his entire adult life building a version of the world, where he was the only one who mattered, and everyone around him existed to confirm that. My mother left when I was 4. Not because she didn't love me. Because staying would have destroyed her. I didn't understand that then. I understand it now. Growing up in our house was like growing up next to a live wire. You never touched it. You barely looked at it. But you always knew it was there, and you always knew what it could do to you. My father worked in finance. He made good money. We had a nice house, a nice car, nice clothes. And from the outside, we looked like every other family on that street. But inside there were rules. And the biggest rule, the one that governed everything, was this: you do not embarrass me. School was where it started to get complicated. I was not a straight A student. I wasn't failing, but I wasn't excelling either. I was somewhere in the middle, which, in my father's world, was the same as failing. The first time he saw a report card with a B- on it, he didn't yell. That was the terrifying part. He just got very quiet. He folded the paper in half. He looked at me, and he said, "This is what you are." That sentence stayed with me for years. It burrowed into me like a splinter I couldn't reach. This is what you are, not this is one grade, not this is one bad week, this is what you are: permanent. Fixed. Final. By the time I was 14, I had stopped trying to show him anything. My grades, my artwork, a story I wrote for the school paper, none of it mattered, because no matter what I brought home, the response was always the same: a pause, a look, and then a comment that made me feel like I had wasted his time just by existing. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about being broken down like that from the inside. It doesn't just make you sad. It makes you invisible. To yourself. You start to genuinely believe that you have nothing to offer the world. That you are taking up space someone else could use better. And that belief doesn't announce itself. It just quietly moves in and starts making decisions for you. I stopped joining things. I stopped raising my hand in class. I stopped writing. I stopped drawing. I stopped doing anything that might produce a result, because every result felt like evidence that my father was right. And then, one afternoon in October, when I was 15, something happened that I still think about every single day. I was in the library after school. Not because I wanted to be there. I was there because I had nowhere else to go. My father didn't want me home before 6. He never said why. He didn't have to. I just knew. So I sat in the back corner of the library and I was pretending to read. But really I was just staring at the pages, and a woman walked up to me and sat down across the table. Her name was Dr. Sandra Reeves. She was a visiting professor from the University of Michigan, and she had been working with a summer program at our school. I didn't know her. She didn't know me. But she looked at the book in my hands, which I was holding upside down, and she didn't laugh. She didn't make a joke. She just looked at me and said, "You look like someone who has a lot to say but has been told not to say it." I didn't respond. I didn't even know how to respond to something like that. Nobody had ever spoken to me that way. Not with pity, not with disappointment. Just with recognition. She asked if she could see what I was actually reading. I showed her the journal I had been hiding inside the book. Pages and pages of writing. Raw, messy, unedited writing that I had been doing in secret for almost 2 years. Writing I had never shown another human being. Writing I was terrified of. Dr. Reeves read for about 10 minutes. She didn't say anything at first. Then she looked up, and her expression had changed. And she said, "Marcus, this is not the writing of someone who is uneducated. This is the writing of someone who sees things other people don't see." I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not in a good way, not yet. In the way that feels like breaking, because something you have been holding together with nothing, but your own tension finally gives. She asked me if I wanted to keep writing. I said yes. She asked if anyone in my life encouraged this. I said no. She didn't ask why. She just nodded like she already knew. Over the next 3 months, Dr. Reeves met with me twice a week in that library. She didn't grade me. She didn't correct me in the way a teacher would. She just read what I wrote, and she asked me questions about it. And slowly, piece by piece, she helped me understand something that fundamentally changed my life. But I want to be specific about what those sessions actually looked like, because it matters. Because the way she helped me was not the way I expected to be helped. She never told me I was talented. She never used that word, talented, because she understood in a way most adults don't, that telling a kid they are talented can actually be paralyzing. It sets up an identity that feels fragile, like something you have to protect rather than something you have to grow. Instead, she asked me questions, hard ones. She would read a passage and she would say, "What were you actually feeling when you wrote this?" And I would have to sit with that, really sit with it, and pull something honest out of myself that I had been burying for years. The first few sessions were almost unbearable, not because she was harsh, but because she was gentle in a way that made me feel exposed, like she could see through every wall I had built. And when you have spent your entire childhood constructing walls to protect yourself from someone who lives in your own house, having someone gently dismantle them, even with kindness, is terrifying. But I kept coming back, twice a week, and every time I came, I brought more pages. And every time I brought more pages, something loosened inside me, like a knot that had been pulled tight for years was slowly releasing. I had a voice. Not a perfect voice. Not a polished voice. But a real one. A voice that had been screaming inside me for years, and I had been told over and over again that it didn't matter. That I didn't matter. And the truth was, it did. I did. But understanding that in your gut and being able to hold on to it when the rest of your world is trying to rip it away, those are two very different things. And I learned that lesson the hard way. By the time I was 16, I had filled 6 notebooks. Dr. Reeves had encouraged me to apply to a summer writing program at a university in Chicago. It was competitive. It was for students from all over the country. And I applied. And I got in. When the acceptance letter came, I made the mistake of leaving it on the kitchen counter. My father found it before I did. I came downstairs that evening and he was sitting at the table with the letter in front of him, and he had that look. The quiet look. The dangerous one. He didn't ask me about it. He didn't congratulate me. He looked at me and he said, "A writing program. You think you're a writer?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. I told him I had been writing for 2 years. I told him that a professor had encouraged me. I told him I had worked for this. And he listened. He actually listened, which was unusual. And then he said something that I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, "Marcus, I have spent my entire career watching people like you walk into rooms with big dreams and walk out with nothing. You don't have the discipline. You don't have the intellect. You are uneducated and you are worthless, and a summer program is not going to change what you fundamentally are." The room went completely silent. I stood there, and I felt everything I had been building for the last year and a half start to collapse. Every notebook. Every conversation with Dr. Reeves. Every quiet, terrifying moment of believing, for the first time in my life, that I might actually be something. All of it, threatened by one sentence from one man. And I almost let it go. I almost nodded and walked away, the way I had 100 times before. Because that was the pattern. That was what I had been trained to do. But something stopped me. And I think it was the fact that this time, he wasn't just talking about a grade or a chore or something small. He was talking about the only thing I had ever found that made me feel alive. And I wasn't willing to let him take that too. So I said, "Then let me show you who I really am." He raised an eyebrow, not impressed, slightly amused, the way you might be amused by a child who says something naive. I went upstairs. I got my notebooks, all 6 of them. And I came back down and I put them on the table in front of him, and I said, "Read them." He didn't pick them up at first. He just looked at them, and then he looked at me. And I could see in his eyes that he expected this to be embarrassing. He expected to open the first page and find exactly what he had already decided I was. So he opened the first notebook. He read for a long time. I stood in the kitchen and I watched him read, and I didn't say a word. I didn't fidget. I didn't defend myself. I just let the words do what I had spent 2 years pouring into them. I let them speak. It took him almost 40 minutes to get through the first 2 notebooks. And during that time, something happened to his face that I had never seen before. The certainty started to disappear. The hard lines around his jaw softened. His eyes moved faster across the pages, the way they do when someone is pulled into something they didn't expect to care about. When he finally looked up, he didn't speak for a long time, and then he said very quietly, "Where did this come from?" I told him about the library, about Dr. Reeves. About the afternoons spent writing in secret because I was terrified of showing anyone. About the acceptance letter and what it meant. And I told him something else, something I had never said out loud to him before. I told him that I had spent most of my life believing I was exactly what he said I was. Uneducated, worthless. And that believing that had almost destroyed me. Not almost, literally almost. There were nights, during my darkest stretch at 14, when I wasn't sure I wanted to keep going. When the weight of feeling like nothing, of being told every single day by the person who was supposed to love me most that I had no value. When that weight became more than I could carry. His face changed when I said that. It changed in a way that I had never seen before. And I realized in that moment that he didn't know. He genuinely did not know how close I had come to disappearing entirely. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. And then my father did something I had never seen him do. Not once, in all the years I had known him. He put his face in his hands, and he cried. I am not going to tell you that everything was fixed after that night. Because it wasn't. That is not how this story works. My father did not transform overnight into the man I needed him to be when I was 7 years old. The damage had been done, years of it, and healing from that kind of damage is not a single moment. It is hundreds of small, painful moments spread across years. But something real shifted that night. Something that mattered. He went to that writing program. He didn't just let me go. He drove me there himself. He didn't say much on the drive. He didn't suddenly become warm or expressive. But he drove me there, and when I got out of the car, he said, "Write something that matters." And I did. That summer changed everything. I spent 6 weeks surrounded by young writers from across the country. And for the first time in my life, I was in a room full of people who understood what it felt like to have something burning inside you that you couldn't explain to anyone else. I wrote more in those 6 weeks than I had in the 2 years before. And by the end of it, I had the first 50 pages of what would eventually become my first book. I was 16 years old. When I got home, my father read those 50 pages too. He didn't say much. But he put them on his desk, and he left them there. And every time I came into his office after that, they were still there. Right in the center of his desk. Where he could see them. The years that followed were not easy. I applied to colleges with a focus on creative writing. I got into programs that people told me were impossible for someone with my academic record. Because here is what nobody tells you about standardized measures of intelligence. They measure a very specific kind of thinking. They do not measure the ability to see inside another human being. They do not measure the capacity to take your own pain and turn it into something that makes someone else feel less alone. Those are skills that no test captures, and they are, in many ways, the most powerful skills a person can have. I got into a program at a school in New York. Full scholarship. My father paid for nothing, not because he couldn't, but because I wouldn't let him. I needed to know that I had earned it. I needed to know that the life I was building was mine. College was where I truly found my footing. I wrote every day. I read everything I could get my hands on. I studied the craft of storytelling the way other students studied chemistry or law. And I discovered something about writing that Dr. Reeves had been trying to show me all along. The most powerful stories are not the ones about extraordinary events. They are the ones about ordinary people in extraordinary pain, and what they do when they decide to stop being silent. There were nights in my dorm room, alone, at 2 in the morning when I would be writing and I would suddenly realize I was crying. Not sad crying, not painful crying, relief crying. The kind of crying that happens when you have been holding something inside you for so long that the act of finally releasing it feels like being set free. Writing was that for me. It was the first time in my life I had a place to put everything. Every feeling I had swallowed. Every word I had bitten back. Every version of myself I had been told didn't matter. I put them all on the page, and for the first time, they had somewhere to live. My professors noticed. Not all of them were kind about it. One of them pulled me aside after a workshop and told me that my work was too raw, too personal, that I needed to learn to distance myself from the material. And I listened to him politely, and then I went back to my room, and I wrote the most honest thing I had ever written in my life. Because I had spent my whole childhood being told to distance myself. To be less. To take up less space. And I was done. I was done making myself smaller so that other people could feel more comfortable. My first published piece was a short story in a literary magazine. It was about a boy who grew up in a house where love was conditional and silence was survival. It was obviously about me. I didn't use my real name. I didn't use my father's name. but anyone who knew us would have recognized the truth in every sentence. My father read it. Someone sent him a copy, I never found out who. He called me afterward, and it was one of the strangest conversations of my life, because he didn't criticize it. He didn't analyze it. He just said, I recognize myself in this. And then he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I'm sorry. 2 words. 2 words that I had been waiting my entire life to hear. And I want to be honest with you about what those words felt like. They didn't fix everything. They didn't erase 16 years of being told I was nothing. But they mattered. They mattered because they were real. And because saying them cost him something. I could hear it in his voice, the effort it took. My father was not a man who apologized. He was not a man who admitted fault. And the fact that he did, in that moment, told me more about who he actually was underneath all the armor he had built than anything else ever had. After that phone call, I didn't hear from him for almost 3 weeks. I didn't reach out either. I didn't know what to say. And I think he didn't know what to say either. We were 2 people who had spent years communicating through silence and criticism, and suddenly we were being asked to communicate through honesty. And neither of us knew the language yet. When he finally called again, he didn't open with an apology. He opened with a question. He said, What do you need from me? And I almost laughed because no one had ever asked me that before. Not once. Not my father, not a teacher, not anyone. What do you need from me? 6 words that I had been starving for my entire life, and they arrived, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I am 26 years old now. I have published 2 novels. I have a literary agent who believes in me. I have a career that is built entirely on the thing my father once told me I could never be. A writer. A storyteller. Someone with something to say. And my father is still in my life. We talk on the phone once a week. He asks about my work. He reads everything I publish. He is not a perfect father. He never will be. But he is trying, in the way that men who spent decades believing their own armor was their identity try, to become something better. But here is what I want you to understand, because this is the part that actually matters, the part that is bigger than my story. The thing my father did to me, the systematic, quiet, persistent destruction of my belief in my own worth, that is not rare. That is happening right now, in millions of homes, to millions of children. And most of those children will never have a Dr. Reeves sit down across from them in a library and say, You have something to say. Most of them will grow up and carry that invisible wound for decades, and it will shape every relationship they have, every decision they make, every version of themselves they allow themselves to become. The most dangerous thing a parent can do is not hit their child. It is not yell at their child. It is tell their child, quietly and consistently, that they are not enough. Because a child who is hit knows they are being hurt. A child who is told they are worthless believes it is the truth. I wrote my first novel because I needed to survive. I needed to take the worst thing that had ever happened to me and turn it into proof that I was still here. That I had not disappeared. That the voice my father tried to silence was louder than his silence ever was. And I want to end with this. If you are someone who is living inside the version of the story I was living inside at 16, if you are someone who has been told, by a parent, by a teacher, by anyone, that you are uneducated, that you are worthless, that you have nothing to offer, I need you to hear me when I say this. They were wrong. Not partially wrong. Not wrong in a way that has a caveat or a qualification. Completely, fundamentally, irreversibly wrong. The fact that someone in a position of power over you decided to believe the worst about you does not make it true. It makes them afraid. It makes them limited. It says everything about what they are carrying and nothing, absolutely nothing, about what you are capable of becoming. I know that hearing those words does not undo the damage. I know that belief, the belief that you matter, that you have value, that your voice deserves to exist in the world, is not something that arrives all at once. It arrives in pieces, in moments, in one person who sees you when no one else bothers to look, find that person, or be that person for someone else. My father looked at me and saw someone who would never amount to anything. And I looked back at him, and I showed him exactly who I was. Not with anger, not with resentment, with the only weapon that had ever worked against his certainty, the truth. And the truth was this. I was never uneducated. I was never worthless. I was a 17-year-old boy sitting in a kitchen, holding 6 notebooks full of proof that the human heart, when it decides to speak, is the most powerful thing in the world. And no one, not my father, not anyone, was ever going to silence it again.